Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome dear friends. In this module we shall discuss the interconnections which exist between and amongst literature, internet and digitalization and the cultural products. We find that in the 21st century there is a certain precariousness which is associated with literary fiction. There have been tremendous changes and developments in technology in the current century. And that is why we find that there are dramatic shifts and changes in the market as well as in the marketability of different cultural products, entertainment goods as well as products of literature. The literary habits as well as tastes and preferences are also changing. We find that gradually preference for the print medium is diminishing and the reading habits of the people in terms of the time they are able to devote in reading a book, and at the same time the medium through which they prefer to read things are also changing. At the same time we find that the preferences of the reading public are changing. If we look at the position of literary fiction in this context, we find that the printed copies sell less. There is a decrease in the sales of literary fiction in the printed volumes of the literary fiction in the past decade, and these are the sales records of almost every country. So we find that for many writers it is not a tenable option anymore to make a career simply by writing fiction. The price of literary fiction has decreased over the past 15 years and the profit margins are also dwindling. As a result of it, we find that publishers also receive less money from the sale of each copy. So emergence and popularity of e-book format is one of the major reasons of the decrease in sales of the printed copies of literary works. The fall in print sales in the book market is directly connected with the availability of e-literature on various platforms now. In these e-book markets also, we find that certain type of books have better sellability. For example, the commercial and popular fiction sells more in comparison to serious books. Therefore, we find that various large prizes have been commissioned and institutionalized to sustain the journals of literary fiction. Even though there are several established writers who are still able to get attractive advances, but in general we find that the level of advances and the amount which is involved in advances is decreasing for most of the writers. So we find that whereas these changes are taking place in the preferences of the reading public, the writing and publication of literary fiction has also come to be dominated by what is termed as the insider networks, and it is very difficult for new writers to create a niche for them in this elite market. Therefore, we find that not for profit support which is there for publication of a literary text is insufficient for most of the writers, and depending on literature production as a career is not considered to be a viable option anymore. It is pertinent here to refer to a work by Tom Swiss, who has written a book, Electronic Literature, What is It, in 2007. This particular book brings our attention to various changes which are taking place in the field of literature, its publication as well as consumption after the introduction of digital technologies. He has stated that literature as such has always been a contested category. There always have been debates about what constitutes literature and how it should be appreciated and what should be the critical paradigms associated with it. He has borrowed a quote which has been initially employed by Joseph Tabi. Joseph Tabi has taken an excerpt from one of the books of Don DeLillo for the epigraph to his essay. And the quote is, "You didn't see the thing because you didn't know how to look, and you don't know how to look because you don't know the names. So the nomenclature is also important." And in a way, we can say that DeLillo's words contextualize Tubby's concern for defining the possibility and conditions of literature's persistence in those environments which have come to be dominated by digital revolution. We can safely say that history of literature in the preceding 50 years has been entwined with the development of digital computers in various formats. When we talk about e-literature, e-fiction, e-poetry, etc., we find that still there are significant overlaps with the traditions of the print medium. The practices, texts, procedures of electronic literature at the same time requires new critical modes and new ways of playing and interpreting the works. Because even though the significant overlap exists, we find that the print traditions alone in themselves are not enough to look at e-literature. The questions which we normally have to face when we try to define e-literature are several. For example, one of the major questions which is often asked is whether electronic literature is really literature. Is the dissemination of literature through internet resulting in what Tom Swiss calls as flood of useless drivel? Is literary quality possible in digital media environment which is marked by easy and immediate participation and circulation? So these are certain questions which face us when we have to look at possibilities of looking at e-literature as a continuation of literature in print medium. Despite overlaps with print traditions, we find that these questions cannot be answered simply by looking at the traditions which were prevalent during the days of literary criticism in print media. The lens of print would be insufficient for it. So we have to look at the divergences because these divergences are equally important. It is pertinent here at this point to refer to another critic. Catherine Hales has said that electronic literature can be understood as both partaking of literary tradition and introducing crucial transformations that redefine what literature is. So Hales has brought our attention to the fact that the tradition is continuing, but the transformations that have taken place within literary genres, there have been crucial transformations in it, and we now have to redefine what literature is. So both these aspects are equally significant. At the same time, we find that the nature of computers is also changing at a very quick pace, and literary community is learning to use these capabilities to its advantage. Majority of the readers still carry the expectations they had from the print days. They still remember the conventions which were associated with the appreciation of literature through print, as well as their expectations from different literary genres are also still defined by their habits of the print medium. Except for the generation which has been born and brought up in the 21st century, we find that the readers' expectations are still dominated by the expectations from the print medium. So electronic literature cannot ignore these expectations. Electronic medium has to accept these expectations built on them, even as it learns to modify them, transform them, change them, and establish its own norms. Simultaneously, we find that the electronic literature works in a context of networked and programmable media, and it is also informed by the powerhouse of contemporary culture. And when we look at the contemporary culture, we find that it incorporates so many diversities. For example, computer games, films, animations, digital arts, graphic design, and electronic visual culture, as well as all the existing traditional parts of literary and cultural productions are available to us. So, there is a powerhouse of contemporary culture. That is why electronic literature has sometimes been termed as a hopeful monster. It is composed of parts taken from diverse traditions that may not always fit together, and therefore it is hybrid by nature. So, it comprises of a trading zone in which different vocabularies, different types of expertise, and different expectations come together. We can say that the electronic literature tests the boundaries of the literature of the literary production and challenges us to rethink our assumptions what literature is, what it can do, and what it can be. It is relatively difficult to define electronic literature. However, we can say that this is the digital born work of literature which can be given the name of electronic literature. It has been defined as a first generation digital object created on a computer and usually meant to be read on a computer. And computer is any type of computing device. It can be a laptop or a desktop or a smartphone or a tablet or any other medium for e-readers. So, it has to be created on a computer and it should normally be read on a computer screen only. It works with an important literary aspect that takes advantage of the capabilities and contexts provided by the standalone or networked computers. The origins of this type of a literature go back to 1950s. In 1959, Theo Lutz had generated a poem using the computers. Commercially, it has been available since the 1990s with works which are published by the Eastgate Systems. So, electronic literature excludes those works of art which are in printed form and which have been digitalized for preservation and dissemination. And therefore, the idea of digital born is important because the electronic literature normally includes those works which are basically written on computer and are being read on a computer screen only. The emergence and evolution of electronic literature is linked to innovations and experimentations with different art forms including literature, dance performance, visual arts, cinema, etc. At the same time, it is influenced by the codes of computers as well as by the facilities and restrictions imposed by different computer-sized platforms. It is a hybrid form, no doubt. It requires its readers to utilize various sensory modalities, for example, the sight, sound, touch, movement, etc., while experiencing it. A very interesting example can be given over here. For example, in a printed text, we find that music is never associated with it. It can be described, musical notes can be described, but the reader cannot actually hear the music in the background. However, one becomes used to listening to musical notes while accessing web-based works. When we talk about electronic literature, we find that there are several genres which are covered under this loose heading. There are hypertext fiction and poetry, interactive fiction and drama, kinetic poetry, generative text, etc. Certain examples may also be quoted over here. For example, Michael Joyce's Afternoon a Story, Stuart Malthorpe's Victory Garden, and Shelley Jackson's Patchwork Girl. A key to understanding electronic literature is the construction of the name of the genre. So, it is not simply poetry, but it is hypertext and poetry. It is kinetic and poetry. It is interactive and drama. So we find that a traditional literary genre is always preceded by a mechanical feature which complements it. So function and form are made apparent in a way that we fail to notice in traditional print forms. At the same time, we find that the role of different programs is also to be noted in a significant manner. There were several works which were written in story space. That was the hypertext authoring program. It was first created by Michael Joyce, J. David Poulter, and John B. Smith, and later on it was licensed to Mark Bernstein of Eastgate Systems, who has improved it and maintained it. This particular software or this particular program, known as the story space, also had certain limitations. It belonged to the early age of electronic literature, and it had limited color options, and at the same time it was not able to handle sound files. It was a primary web authoring tool, however it is still used to produce new works. It has not become absolutely redundant even today. But we find that as the World Wide Web developed, new authoring programs and new methods of dissemination became available to literary writers. So electronic literature renews the centrality of technology. The nature of electronic literature has also changed, and we find that around 1995, the second generation of electronic works started. Hales has classified the early works with certain characteristics. These early works of electronic literature had limited graphics. They still had animations, they used color and sound, and they also used hypertext links. In comparison, the later works had a better use of the multimodal capabilities of the web, and they used a variety of navigation schemes and interface metaphors. However, we find that electronic literature is still a fairly new and young genre, even though critics are already talking about two generations of electronic literature. For most of the public, it is still a young genre. Public which is used to the printed form of literature is now only becoming aware of its rise, and we can refer to various institutionalized ways of referring to electronic media, the ways in which it is combined together, it is being presented for the benefit of the readers. For example, Ceylon.com, After E-Literature There Is No Going Back, the Huffington Post, New World Order, E-Lit Plays with Language, and Readings at the Kitchen in NYC in 2012 and 13 showcase that people are now becoming conscious of it. At the same time, we find that it has been mainstreamed with traditional literature in various associations. For example, the MLA's conferences as well as Association of Writers and Writing Programs have combined it with the traditional literature. The growth of digital humanities, which is a new computer-based approach to research, analysis, teaching, all aspects of pedagogy in fact, has also brought a renewed awareness to the possibilities which are now available to us in the form of electronic literature. In the digital age, the manner in which we read a text or write something has also changed. We are now talking about books which are being written for the internet, books which are being authored by it, or books which have been deeply associated with it or influenced by it in various ways. We have also learned to differentiate between digital textuality and new literacies. What happens to literature when it interfaces with the prospect of the digital, of digital technology and digital culture, has become a central point of view. We also want to differentiate between readers who become literate because of the screen rather than the printed page. And here we have to differentiate between literariness and the new literacies. These two words are different, and new literacies refers to those people whose ways of reading is radically different from the traditional reading ways, and new literacies refers to the capacity to read on the basis of the screen only, and how quickly to scan the screen, how quickly to use the hypertext, and how quickly to use different associations, and the manner in which we learn and grasp new literacy is very different from the conventional and traditional literariness. So, we find that there is a shift from traditional forms of reading. In traditional forms of reading, we find that one used to invest in a single book or in a single author over a period of time. But reading in the web, social networking ways has become an altogether different experience. So now we read hypertextually across pages, and we engage with content from different sources, and there is also a rapid movement between different sources. Not only this, we find that as readers we can also produce our own content. So now we find that there is an interface between readers and writers. Writers can become readers, and readers can also become writers. The phenomena of digital literature, therefore, is not necessarily located in the academy only. Whereas the traditional literary art and literary production was located in the academy, it is also an international phenomena. It cannot be located at a particular place. It unfolds on the internet. It is being created in different languages, and internet allows anyone and everyone to publish and access these works either in the language of our choice or through translation. One can now achieve popularity almost in an instantaneous manner, and all of us are familiar with the phenomena of going viral overnight. So the question of the genre has now become complicated. It is an experimental genre, and sometimes it may be considered as an art, sometimes it can be considered as a film or a media or a performance more than literature. There are various critics who are not comfortable with this new and emerging genre, and sometimes it has also been termed as a postmodern joke. However, we find that the digital literature is flourishing, and one interesting example is a website which is known as Young Hee Chang Heavy Industries Work website, which is an interesting example of digital literature. Another example of digital literature is North Korean Cunnilingus, which is a collaborative project between two writers. This particular project is internet specific, and collaboration is associated more with the internet than the single author economy of the print media. It is a sophisticated way of working because it requires a lot of skills on the part of all the participants, and still it is shocking. One can find it simple and approachable, but the very idea is very fresh and very new. So we find that with the help of the digital revolution, the intertextuality is becoming day by day enriching, and politically and aesthetically it is also becoming sharper. We are looking at the digital literature in a context of multimedia literary artwork, where we find that the written word or the word which we look at on the screen is inseparable from image of text, sound as well as movement. So the word is not a word anymore. It is not a simple word anymore. Rather, it has become a textual performance, and it challenges how we understand and think of literature, and therefore it sometimes becomes difficult to talk about digital literature just in terms of written content. Another example in this context of digital literature which can be given is Michael Joyce's 12 Blue. It is more conventional insofar as it is text based and it is a digital work about the sea. But this work has been called the grandfather of hypertext. It has been influenced by the works of James Joyce because the writing style flows. It has the same poetic strain which we often find in Joyce. It incorporates not only verbal but visual puns based on sea metaphors, etc. It is constituted as a hypertext. It is just text on a screen in which the lexias have been used, And lexias are the non-linear narrative comprised of chunks of text connected by links that demand reader interaction to produce the plot. Digital literature therefore makes more sense if we just look at it rather than describe it in words. So there are implications about writing, reading and teaching digital literature, and these implications are very different and almost revolutionary. One has to be aware that when we say that different readers would approach it differently, we do not only want to suggest that the meanings which the different readers would take away are different, but rather we would say that different readers would read digital literature in different orders and therefore they would understand it differently. The very approach has become different. So it creates a highly flexible and open-ended text. It uses its inventive form to create great content, and readers may forget that they are navigating a disorienting hypertext on their screen, so it also becomes an immersive experience for the readers. In the print medium also, we find that certain proto-hypertext literature is also available. The earliest example which comes to our mind is, of course, Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne, a novel which was published way back in 1759. We can also refer to Nabokov's Pale Fire, a novel which was published in 1962, which in fact presents a poem of 999 lines within it. Another example which immediately comes to our mind is Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, an experimental novel which was published in 1996 with endnotes, and it is often characterized as an encyclopedic novel. This novel has used not only the endnotes but various other techniques to create a non-linear reading experience for the readers. When we talk about electronic literature, we find that there are certain major genres in it. It may be treated as a combination of the genres of print literature as well as certain genres which are unique to networked and programmable media. The first genre which we can refer to here is the hypertext fiction. It is characterized by linking structures. Often it is written in story space, the hypertext authoring program, but at the same time various other authoring programs and methods of distribution have emerged after the development of the World Wide Web. In the early works we find that blocks of text which were called lexia were used, limited graphics were there, but still we could use animation, limited choice of colors as well as limited soundtracks. After the incorporation of the World Wide Web revolution, we find that other works of multimodal capabilities became prominent. So more contemporary and postmodern genres as opposed to first generation or classical works of electronic fiction are now coming into circulation. So we can say that there are mutations into a range of hybrid forms, and if we look at certain examples, this idea becomes clear to us. So there is a picaresque hypertext, The Unknown by Dirk Stratton, Scott Redberg and William Gillespie. It is known for the aesthetics of access. Another example can be given of Caitlin Fisher's These Waves of Girls. It is remarkable for its use of sound, spoken text, animated text, graphics and other functionalities in a networked linking structure. At the same time, we can also refer to a multimodal work, Regan Library, which is by Stuart Mouthrops. It features QuickTime movies with random text generation. Richard Holton's parodic Frequently Asked Questions about hypertext also develops a narrative with annotations to a poem. We can also talk about a particular genre which is known as network fiction. This term has been introduced by David Sicorico to define digital fiction that makes use of hypertext technology in order to create emergent and recombinatory narratives. The term interactive fiction is also becoming prominent now, and it is becoming more and more pertinent because it contains strong game elements. There is a differentiation between electronic literature and computer games, but at best this differentiation is only fuzzy. There are many games which have narrative elements, and there are many works of electronic literature which have game elements. So, in interactive fiction, we find that user configures in order to interpret and depends on inputs from the user. Nick Montfort has preferred the term interactor in his work Twisty Little Passages, an approach to interactive fiction. So, we find that the essential elements of interactive fiction include a parser and an interactor. A parser is the computer program that understands and replies to the inputs given by interactor, and a simulated world within which the action takes place. The interactor controls the action by issuing commands, and instructions to the program are called directives. Interactive fictions expand the range of literary techniques. They incorporate alternative strategies between gameplays and novelistic elements, visual displays, graphics, animations, and clever modifications of traditional literary devices. It can also engage in self-referential commentary and critique, and the exploration of the z-axis as an additional dimension for text display, behavior, and manipulation by artists like David Noebel, Ted Warnell, Charles Baldwin, and Dan Weber can also be referred to here. Another term with which we should be familiar today is the generative term. It is a use of algorithm to generate texts according to a random scheme or rearrangement of pre-existing texts. Philip Booth has presented a model, and his model makes clear distinctions between the writer's field, the text's field, and the reader's field. So, there is a use of randomizing algorithms and visualizations. It breaks coherent structures and syntax. Cuts up and fold in techniques are also used in it. Certain examples can be listed here. For example, the set of you poem with text, pictures, and programming and music. Similarly, employment of the n-gram technique to find similar strings in the source and target documents, using them as bridges to splice together the two texts. Electronic poetry is another genre which is becoming popular. Los P. Glazier had been the founder of the Electronic Poetry Center. Another premier online site for electronic poetry on the web is known as Ubu Web, which is handled by Kenneth Goldsmith. In his book Digital Poetics, Hypertext, Visual Kinetic Text, and Writing in Programmable Media, Glazier argues certain points. He suggests that electronic literature should be seen as a continuation of experimental print literature. It carries forward certain traditions of experimental print literature and builds further on them. This medium allows us to disrupt traditional notions of stable subjectivities and ego-centered discourses. The experimental practice is grounded in the materiality of the medium. His white-faced bromedials on 20 hectares uses JavaScript to investigate literary variants, and a new text is generated after every 10 seconds, and there is a disruption of narrative poetic lines. Disruption of poetic lines, suggestive couplings, dynamic interplay between the lines, and the operations of the algorithm are some of the features of the digital poetry. Code work, which is a linguistic practice in which English is hybridized with programming expressions to create a Creole evocative for human readers, is also being used. As an example, we can quote Perl poems that literally have two addressees, human beings as well as intelligent machines. Transliteral morphing, which is basically algorithm that transforms source text into target words letter by letter, emphasizes the discreteness of alphabetic languages and its similarities to the discreteness of the digital codes. Some other forms which can be referred to here can be given under the title of flash fiction and internet. So flash fiction is a type of a really short story. So it's a type of really short story. It is concise and brief, below 2000 words, and it usually offers character or plot development in a nutshell. There are many other types of fiction now on electronic media which are based on word count. For example, 6-word story, which is a variation of the haiku poems, we can say, dribble or mini saga, which is of 50 words, drabble or microfiction comprising of 100 words, the 280 character story, that is the Twitter fiction, the sudden fiction, which is 750 words, flash fiction, which is between 1000 to 2000 words, and at the same time nanotale and micro story are available now on the digital medium. We can see that the origins of literary experimentation as well as the origins of the short story go back to the 19th century, and these type of plot structures were very popular among writers of short stories in the 20th century also. The short stories have unique literary quality because they have an ability to suggest or later on to imply a larger story. In literary history, we have also seen how different writers develop a complete novel from a short story which was written by them earlier. Some of the early practitioners whose work remains significant in these days in this particular context are Kafka, O. Henry, Chekhov, Somerset Maugham, Ernest Hemingway, Arthur Clarke, etc. So there is a recent resurgence due to the popularity of digital culture. And when we talk about digital culture, we find that it incorporates social media, Instagram, blogging, Twitter, as well as several other options. So we find that the role of social media is significant in the growth of this genre. So we can refer to the anonymous writer, Terribly Tiny Tales, Word Porn, the Third Word Press, which have used flash fiction to create stories on social media platforms. So we also have print journals as well as online journals. Haley suggests that the formation we know as literature is a complex web of activities now, and now it includes much more than conventional images of writing and reading. Exploring and understanding the full implications of what the transition from page to screen entails must necessarily be a community effort. It is a momentous task that calls for enlightened thinking, visionary planning, and a deep critical consideration. It is in these wide and capacious senses that electronic literature challenges us to rethink what literature can do and be. Thank you.